Oh. Oh. Hariom, and greetings from Niagara Falls. Yesterday morning, we commenced the highest vocation. 155 seekers are gathering to learn and to practice contemplation. And what I had shared with them was, how privileged are we that all of us are getting to learn and practice contemplation. We had requested all those who are joining to also donate towards the African Wildlife Foundation, which seekers did, that we're so privileged we get to learn how to be cheerful and practice generosity to help nature's animals. Our mentorship Sangha is of a similar setup in the sense that we have 109 seekers who are part of this community, and we get to nurture meaningful friendships. And a auxiliary benefit are our professional workshops on such a broad and deep array of subjects. To have utility in two ways for the same action is really a point of privilege. Last month, our workshop focused on safety of society, with a particular focus on gun violence and what we can do as individuals, as families, as communities to cultivate the safety of society. I was interacting with some of our team members about where we're going to go with this, and one of our team members shared, safety of society should be a permanent offering in our community. That after we complete this year focusing on gun violence, next year we should focus on domestic violence and what we can do to stop that individually, in our families, communities. And we've already planted the seed for this. Since 2020, every Navaratri, that is the celebration we're in right now, we have an effort called Elevate Her Story. And thus far, we've raised over $100,000 to protect our women. Today, we've started Elevate Her Story again. We're aspiring to raise $25,000 to address domestic violence, child abuse in the Cleveland community. So safety of society will go on. Unfortunately, it will go on in the sense that it's needed, but this is what our community is doing. Now, this month's workshop. I just came back from Toronto, and I was interacting with a group of young families on the purpose and practice of sadhana. And I tried to share this in a very simple way. Many are new to the science of oneness. The most difficult part of our lives is our relationships, especially the ones we choose. And the reason why relationships are most difficult, because our relationships are constantly changing. Our thoughts, our feelings, really, this is me being polite, for our moods. Our relationships are constantly changing. And so, changing with our changing relationships is sadhana. That is development. And if we do this, though our relationships are changing, they're still in alignment. And when relationships are aligned, there is fulfillment then. Development, alignment, fulfillment. Part of self-development when it comes to relationships is saying yes in terms of acceptance, in terms of forgiving. Part of it is saying no in terms of compromising on ideals, not looking after yourself as much. And that's what this month's workshop will focus on. And we have a great seeker, thinker, professional to facilitate how to create boundaries in relationships. Team?
Hariom, everyone. We're very excited to introduce Parag. Before we do, just a note from the coordinating team that the session here is meant for education and reflection purposes only, and it's not a substitute for treatment or advice from a professional. So please, if you do need that support, to seek it out from a qualified professional. So just with that quick disclaimer, I just wanted to introduce Parag, who is actually my sibling, my brother, and he's a child and adolescent psychiatrist practicing in the world today, seeing patients on a daily basis. He's also a Sevak of the Chinmay Mission. He's been a part of many of our wellness workshops, sharing his knowledge. So we're really grateful this topic of creating boundaries has come up for many of the mentors and mentees. And so we're excited to hear Parag's perspective and reflect on that and discuss that today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Parag.
Right. Hariom, everybody, and Hariom and pranams to Vivekji, and thank you very much for the coordinators of the Chinmaya Nagra Mentorship Sangha for setting this up and such a topic that is just very relevant to our day to day. As Pooja mentioned, and what I do when I'm not in Chinmaya Mission or I guess it's part of sadhana, I suppose, but is I work as a psychiatrist. I work with primarily kids and families. And what we often see, or what I often see in my work, but we often just see in the world and in interacting with my own family and interacting just with my neighbors and my friends, is that there are often a lot of conflicts around boundaries. And that's the topic of discussion today. We really want to kind of dive a bit deeper into that. What does, psychology say about this? What do we sort of understand about boundaries? And how can we kind of just, kind of get to know them a bit better, and also get some practice really in how do I set boundaries effectively? What does the research say about that? How can I sort of understand, knowing how difficult this topic is, how can I engage in it perhaps a bit differently? So I often come across our difficulties between parent and child, difficulties with siblings with each other, and then of course difficulties just outside of the family unit. But I think today I just want to focus on the family primarily. Boundaries are a very complex topic, and it's influenced by a number of different factors, of course. Culture is a big part of that, though. And in part of my work, I'm very lucky to work with the South Asian population, kind of in the Chicago area. And so I just maybe want to talk about that as well, just a bit. Just unique challenges that we see in the South Asian population with family systems, kind of, as well as just how culture influences how we can set boundaries, and the differences that we might see in a Western versus more Eastern or more Indian approach with managing boundaries. And so, just to start, that's a bit of an introduction, but just to start, and I'd like maybe to be as interactive as you can possibly make it. And so I'd love if you guys just keep, chatting away, or raise your hand, ask questions at any point. And so with that in mind, what I wanted to ask first is just for the group, and you can feel free to put in the chat. When you think about boundary, what comes to mind first? So when someone says the word boundary, what do you think of? Space, saying no, guardrails, limits, comfort level. saying no gracefully and respectively, wall or bubble, privacy, yeah, absolutely. Respecting your own mental health, absolutely. Open communication, sphere of influence. I love that. And so it's funny. It's a very psychologically minded group. I appreciate that. Usually, when I think of boundaries, I think of demarcations on a map, basically, right? We think of separating border crossings between places, or even just like a fence between neighbors, right? Or even the wall between two rooms. So we have this idea of physical boundaries, and this is very much what we live in, and we sort of expand that psychologically to think about this invisible line that we sort of draw around ourselves. And it's often seen as a negative thing. I think it's something that I'm not seeing that in the chat necessarily, but we often think of setting boundaries as sort of something we are hesitant to do, that we feel a bit anxious about. Part of it is we don't want to be seen as, and this is just maybe a stereotype that comes up, we don't want to be seen as being uncaring. We don't want to be seen as trying to control other people. And so one of the challenges that we often have is we don't set boundaries, whether it's with family, whether it's outside of the family, and then we get very overwhelmed with our relationships. Relationships don't feel something that's joyful to enter into. They just feel stressful. And so with that in mind, why work on managing boundaries? Why are we even here? And there's some benefits to that. The one is that we feel more empowered in relationships, so that we feel when we engage in a relationship that we're a bit more respected and that we feel more confident in how we can interact with others. It improves our own self-esteem, but it also just generally improves the quality of the relationship itself, that people know where we stand on certain things. And if there is mutual respect, which isn't always the case, but if there is mutual respect, the relationship can become very intimate and very deep, and especially within a family. And so let's just get started. You can all see actually can't see the slides. Or can you see the slides yet or no? No, okay, let me start sharing that. How about now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so we just wanted to get started with kind of what I was saying before, just kind of the key ideas what we're talking about today. So what are healthy boundaries? Let's just kind of jump right into the topic. Boundaries, I like to differentiate between boundaries and rules. And so a good definition that I've come across a few times with, what is a boundary is defining the limits about what's appropriate in a relationship that you set for yourself. And that's the key part of it. So defining the limits, I think that's fairly obvious of kind of deciding where the boundary is, about what's appropriate, right? What do you feel comfortable in the relationship? But the most important part of that is that you set for yourself. So it differentiates that from rules. So what's the difference between a boundary and a rule? We tend to think of rules as the um, influence that you are having on other people and the guidelines that you set for other people. So a good example of that is a law, right? A law occurs, right? We have a law in society, and then we acquiesce to follow that law. So the law is telling us what to do with our behavior. And if we don't do that, then there is some sort of threat associated with that or some sort of consequence associated with that. I mean, you can think of a stoplight, right? I am driving a car, so I've agreed to the set of laws, these set of rules, and the government or the whoever's imposing that law is telling me if I don't follow this, then there's going to be a significant consequence. So they're trying to tell me what I can do and what I cannot do. That's the difference between that and a boundary. A boundary is what you set for yourself, a decision that you make for yourself to say, if this relationship gets to this point, then I will take some action for me. It doesn't matter what the other person is going to do. What matters is what I'm going to do in the situation. And so that you're very empowered in that sense, that you're the one who makes the decision on what to do with a boundary, as opposed to a rule or a law where you're only as powerful in the relationship as you can enforce that rule upon somebody else. Questions on that? Does that make sense? One of the challenges that we often see in boundary setting is that we get confused between the two, that we try to set rules with other people when in fact we should be setting boundaries with ourselves. And so people naturally when you set a rule on somebody, you say you must do this, you often get a lot of pushback, right? You often get immediate, sometimes pushback, and often responds as anger and well, why would I do that? It's very different from setting a boundary. Setting a boundary is making a decision that this is a limit to what I'll accept in a relationship, and if this goes beyond that, then I have a consequence that I will employ on myself. And so with that, so let's talk about relationship itself. And we think this is a question maybe to kind of think about for oneself. What are your needs in a relationship? Because essentially what a boundary is you are trying to get your needs met in that relationship, whether it's parent, child, or sibling, or whatever relationship there may be. What are some of the needs that you have or that are commonly sought after in a relationship? The first is safety. And this is kind of a list of more general ones, and there's many, many more, but these are kind of the most common ones. If there isn't safety in a relationship, there almost isn't a relationship, right? Or it's a relationship that's very, very power imbalanced. And it's often a place where boundaries absolutely need to be set. We'll talk later about porous versus diffuse boundaries, but often with safety issues, we have to set very rigid boundaries in what we do. And then trust, right? You want to be able to trust that the other person in what they do and their behavior, and you want them to be able to trust you. Affection, especially in families, right? You wouldn't necessarily think affection in terms of, say, a workplace relationship or what have you, but in a family, you want affection. Acceptance. And this is a big one that we tend to see, at least I see in my clinical practice quite often, of say a child does not feel accepted by their parents, right? They feel like the parents want them to be a certain way. And if they are that certain way, great, acceptance is granted. But if they're not that way, then there's a limit to what acceptance is there. And so how does a child sort of set a boundary with the parents with that? Cooperation. I mean, this is one we often see in marriages, for example, right? We have a certain amount of just labor that's in a marriage, right, or in a family unit, and how do we sort of divide that up? How can we kind of cooperate together? And that's balanced with autonomy. So a very fundamental need. And this one is often, can I get my own needs met as a person while still in relationship with the other person? And say again with the marriage, for example, of can I have my needs met with the time that I need, to pursue my goals or my hobbies or my interests, without the other individual, say, demanding that I need to be with them, for example. So these are kind of basic aspects of relationship that is a sign of a healthy relationship typically. Can you think of any others? These are kind of some of the basics, but any others that come to mind? Feel free to put it in the chat. Reciprocity. Okay. Any others? Tough question, I guess. Unwritten family traditions, and this is a very interesting one because it pushes on that autonomy a little bit, right? This is the way a family has been running for forever, perhaps, and if I don't want to do that, then that's often a place where boundaries have to be set. So, understanding, absolutely, yeah. Feeling heard. Authenticity, absolutely. And so with that, I wanted to ask, again, this is something you put in the chat, what are some characteristics of a family member that you feel, how dare you? Yeah, absolutely. How dare a younger person challenge older people? That's something that comes up again and again and again. What are sort of the underlying rules that rule, right? That's a rule that's sort of imposed, that this is a rule a child must never address or challenge an older person immediately. The children react to that typically. And so I want you to think of a family member that you feel really safe and respected by. What are some of the characteristics of that person? What makes that relationship special? You don't essentially put in anything in the chat, just something to kind of reflect on. Non-judgmental, an active listener. If you're an adult, you're not free to challenge. Yes. Judgment. Mhm. And how about someone you don't have healthy boundaries with? You don't have to name who. I'm just saying, imagine that person. Um, and what does it feel like when you're in their presence? What for you internally? What does it feel like? Criticism, feeling unheard. Yeah, kind of like the flip side of the first question, right? Yeah, strings. Yeah, walking on eggshells, draining energy, stubbornness, unnecessary anger, unempathic. So think about what you're writing there. Any of those points, lack of empathy, judgment, when you feel like you're walking on eggshells, um, those may be signs that a boundary maybe needs to be established. Um, it's one of the sort of ways to know that we're perhaps our boundaries are being tested. Um, when you walk into a room with somebody, especially a member of the family, you want the first category, right? You want all the things you were saying, non-judgmental, good listen. But if you're not receiving that, then it's a red flag or perhaps a yellow flag, maybe, of okay, something to kind of pay attention to in that relationship because there's something off about it. There's something worth really kind of noting very carefully. So, you talk about boundary violations, and the first rule of boundary violations, or just with setting boundaries and understanding boundaries in general, is first getting to know your own feelings. This idea of you really can't set boundaries unless you kind of know what the situation is between you and the individual and where the boundary is. And the way to find that out is to search your own feelings inside and see where do you feel, how do you feel when you're in the presence of this person, or when you're going to be in the presence of that person. I always think of, say, Thanksgiving dinner, the kind of the classic story of there are some people that are worried by March about Thanksgiving in November, because at least in the US, because they're just afraid to be around certain people, right? That's a place where boundaries, it's sort of that's flashing red light. Okay, this is a place where you need to start setting boundaries. So take a look at this list. These are often yellow and kind of yellow going to red flags of when boundaries are being violated, especially within families. And does any of this sound familiar? My guess is probably yes, but um, the comparison, this is something that's very, 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 very common. Um, I see a lot in with families, of course, comparing one kid versus another. Or you didn't your friend got an A but you didn't get an A on this test. That kind of stuff. It starts often very early. Um, pressuring others, giving unsolicited advice. Um, that one is it. I think a lot of people don't realize just how painful that can be. Because the person giving the unsolicited advice thinks that they're actually being helpful typically. But it often kind of comes across as being an intrusive or an invasion. Then it kind of gets deeper and deeper from there, making hurtful or unnecessary comments, guilting. So kind of turning the relationship into, if you cared about me, then you would. So making a relationship, going from unconditional to very conditional of, you can only demonstrate that you care about me if you do what I say, essentially kind of taking somebody hostage, emotionally at least. Disregarding personal space, and then kind of getting into verbal and and sadly physical aggression. So there's sort of a spectrum of violations that again start pretty early on in life. Between parent-child relationships, you see this often even in infants working with parents, and it just kind of goes on and on from there. So when you're noticing, so the reason I put this slide up is when you're kind of noticing these feelings kind of coming up, bring the whether it's frustration, whether it's anger, whether it's feeling judged, start to pay attention to, are any of these things happening in this relationship? Is this something that you're kind of picking up on? So I wanted to signal out anger in particular, especially as those of us who study Vedanta, we often, really kind of focus on managing anger. We try to work through our anger. We try to limit our anger. We try to, practice ways to not be angry. We sort of see anger as sort of maybe in a moral compass of, maybe this isn't necessarily a good thing, right? We try to, we put a moral frame on it. So I wanted to kind of maybe think of it in a different way. Seeing anger is actually a tool, as a diagnostic tool, but not a therapeutic tool. And what do I mean by that? You don't want to be going around as an angry person, just yelling and hitting people and all that sort of stuff. Okay, that's not what we were talking about. That'd be using anger as a treatment. I don't like something, and so I'm going to react and become angry with somebody else. But anger can be very useful potentially as a signal. Basically, in the animal kingdom, for example, anger is a very primitive response to boundary violations. And usually, say you can imagine a lion sort of marks its territory, right? And then another lion kind of intrudes in. The response oftentimes is anger, right? It's a flash of anger that arises. Now, of course, we humans are more sophisticated, but our programming kind of contains some of those threads, some of those ancient threads that are there. And so when we notice anger coming up, it's important not to react to that anger. It's important not to, especially, cause harm to others when that anger arises. But it can be very useful to see that anger as a signal. That's our body and our mind telling us that a boundary is being violated. It's a time to really sort of say, let me pay attention to what's happening now, because something is occurring in my environment that's triggering this signal for me. It's an opportunity, really, for further inquiry. And so that's the main one that we often see. And again, that's inherited from ancient times. But shame, inadequacy. With inadequacy, we often blame ourselves when things go wrong, second guessing our own decisions, things like that. Especially if someone else is kind of with criticism, right? If someone's being excessively critical, we just take that on ourselves. So that's why inadequacy is put in there, and feeling trapped in in extreme situations, unfortunately, dissociation. What that means is a lack of connection to reality. Say in trauma, for example, that's often associated with dissociation. So these are all sort of, if these things are happening, again, it's a signal to say, let me start to pay very close attention to what's happening in this environment, and especially if there are boundary violations occurring. So how do we set boundaries? Basically, there's three steps involved. And, I like to say opening the toll booth. At the beginning, we were talking about kind of having this sort of bubble around you, this protective sphere. And another way of thinking about that is, you can imagine a toll booth where it's down most of the time, right? That you're not allowed to cross. Someone can't just infiltrate my boundaries without me sort of having a response. I open that toll booth when I feel comfortable, when I feel safe. And so how do we sort of use that sort of frame? How do we actually set boundaries? So first thing we do is we state the feeling. We tell people how their actions made us feel. When the common example, when you said this to me, I felt hurt, I felt angry. In an as non-judgmental tone as you can. Because that's often associated with a lot of it's an immediate jump to that person feels like we're criticizing them, right? No, we might actually be, perhaps, but we want to say it in a sense of, this is how I felt when this situation occurred. When you did this, I felt that way, right? And it could be it doesn't have to be negative, it can be positive too, right? When you told me I did a great job on my math test, I felt great about it, right? You're kind of setting, you're sort of allowing that person to understand your feelings in response to their actions. So second is request a change. So we ask the person, we make a request. Again, not a rule where you make a demand or force somebody, but you make a request to say the boundary was crossed, and if they could change their behavior or stop the action that made us feel that way. We don't have the power to force anything when it comes to boundaries, but we have the power to make requests to others. And the last is to inform the person of the consequences of if they don't change their behavior, what you are going to do differently in that situation. If you do this, then I will have to do this. And it very much is not, again, it's not, you're not forcing a situation, you're just saying, you're just letting them know that this is what you are going to do is in response to their behavior. Questions on that? It does sound a lot like nonviolent communication. Yes, absolutely right. Let's practice. The thing about boundaries is we can talk about it all we like, but until you're actually in the thick of it and practicing, it's hard to get. It's one of those things where you actually have to kind of do it to sort of get a feel for it. So this would be a time for the coordinators if we could split up into groups. And what I'd like to do is I have 4 sample boundary violations, but feel free to come up with your own. These are just 4 that I happen to think of that seem like they're relatively common. The first is a parent giving unsolicited advice about your personal life or relationship. This is the classic, the uncle or auntie saying, well, how come you're not married yet? Like that kind of thing, right? Or you should talk to that person, that kind of idea. And then second, your sibling criticizes your parenting style or your career if you don't have kids, in front of you. So something that you feel very personal, a lot of personal investment in, as someone who you care about, kind of criticizing that in front of you. The third one is a child is upset. You won't give them. This is the kid in the store throwing a temper tantrum. They're yelling at you. They're being hostile. You're the worst mommy in the world. That sort of stuff. And then the fourth is kind of the Thanksgiving dinner kind of idea of you're sort of cringing quietly in your seat. They're making political sexist jokes, racist, something like that. They're making you feel uncomfortable. And so using this frame, state your feeling, request a change, and then communicate a consequence. What I'd like to do is if we can break into groups, let's practice these out. And if the coordinators are the way to kind of keep the chat open or keep the slide open, to kind of practice that. And we'll reconvene in, say, about 10 minutes or so. With the one, the uncle aunt makes jokes that are racist, one potential consequence could be I for myself, I'm going to become much more mindful of how much hate is there in the world, and I'm going to really kind of work to become the opposite of that. That in this moment, this person has given me the resolve to say, I wasn't before that serious about doing that, but now I will really do this. I'm going to make sure that I'm a light out to the world. That is a consequence that you're putting upon yourself in response to this person's behavior. It doesn't mean you have to agree with anything they said. And in fact, you're thinking the opposite. And it may be that they're really hostile, that, okay, I do have to kind of step back. But that's kind of what I mean by consequences. What are you going to do to change yourself as a result of this interaction? So I'll tell you my go-to strategy with that, because I get plenty of unsolicited advice all the time, and I often struggle with what to do with that. And what I look at that is the unsolicited advice is coming from a story that person is telling themselves. So you pick any sort of, I don't know, I don't know, make one up of people have to be in. I can't even think of one right now, but whatever. So whatever, what I do is I ask them where they got that idea from, and could they tell me more of their life story that is relevant to that. So to kind of turn it from you must do this, kind of yes, no, very binary, very rigid type of discussion to let's tell a story. Let's talk about our experiences. You have to wake up early in the morning, right? Someone's telling you that you can't stay sleepably. I've gotten that one before. You can't sleep in late. You really have to be up in the morning. You have to be a go-getter. I'll just make that one up. That's coming from a story, right? That person is so passionate about some belief that they're willing to talk to you ad nauseum about that, right? Where is that passion coming from? There must be some interesting story behind that. That's what their parent told them when they were young, or that's they've had hardships and they had to learn this hard lesson, and that'd be interesting to find out. So kind of turning a very binary, you must do this, yes or no, moral type of story into a discussion into a narrative of story. Let's get to know this person and where this idea is coming from, because they're so passionate about it. It must mean something very deep to them. And why is that? That could be one way to kind of open up, so that you're stuck in that car for that hour and a half. It becomes, in fact, a joyful experience. Looking through the chat, sometimes making the other person uncomfortable by asking them questions. It's kind of the same idea. So, you're telling that person that you're growing too, and they're coming to you for advice. You're kind of sharing that, you're not a wise sage that's giving advice. You're you, right? You're just a human being, and your advice has limits to it. And so for them to kind of take that as it with everything that you say with a grain of salt, you're kind of setting that frame with them of you. They're coming to advice. They want that from you, and that you're not someone who gives advice because you're still developing yourself. I think it's that humility that you just expressed, that answer. I think that would be, unless someone is really kind of thick, that would be very disarming for most people. So that might be one strategy. And then also, I guess, directing that individual to whom you feel would be the better source of advice as well. So. Excellent question. I think it is a spectrum, right? So there are definitely some situations where you may just have to remove yourself if it's too even traumatic to necessarily even discuss situations or just even talk about things, and that's that just has to happen. Just has to happen. But outside of that, what they're saying is triggering some sort of pain within you at that moment, right? It's triggering something. To really kind of explore why that might be. This person maybe it's interesting just how that person may have no idea right in that moment, and perhaps they do and they're being a bully, but they're just kind of talking. But there's something about what they said that has some resonance to you deep inside. That's a kind of like I mentioned with anger. That's a sign, or that's an opportunity for inquiry. Say, what is it about what this person said that is causing so much pain and causing so much emotion in me? If you're able to handle that at the moment, then continue to have the conversation. If the emotion is kind of just getting to be too much, then absolutely it's okay to take a step back. And so that might be where that decision is made. Of I see this as an opportunity for inquiry. I inquire, and it's not. I'm not able to go forward. Fine, you're absolutely okay to take a step back. But if you are, then you're essentially allowing that person is giving you a gift in a sense of being able to have you inquire into something that's causing a lot of pain that you can address going forward.
Hariom, everyone. Special Hariom to Parag. Thank you so much for having us for coming and attending our wellness workshop and presenting for all of us. When we think about mentorship, we think about authenticity and depth in relationships. And I think that speaking about this, it helps us all be vulnerable, and being vulnerable in a safe space, which is really important. Hariom, everyone. Thanks for joining us.